Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's got to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, and supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And, of course, Joel, as you know, is an architect, and certainly he designs high-security homes, and he's actually has so much demand from people of beings wanting to build secure homes that, well, he's not going to be able to be with us for our morning programs, but we're hoping at least for the next month or so to be able to keep him on the afternoon program so we can know what his views are on what's going on. Joel, bring us up to date on what's taking place and your views and your interpretation of unfolding events.
Well, thank you, Stan. Just to follow on your introduction, I am traveling and out of state. It's interesting that I haven't worked in high-security architecture for nearly 30 years. This is the first time that I've seen really wealthy people come into the preparedness movement. Even the wealthy now are appearing to say to themselves, I don't think this is fixable. I don't think government's going to be able to fix things, and I don't think my money's going to protect me if it's stuck in the market. So they're starting to, believe that you have to put it into physical security, physical stockpiles of things, and I think this is a very good sign. I was hoping to be retired by now, but it doesn't look like that, and so I'm working, and because of those restrictions, it's hard to meet my interview schedule, but I'm happy that this particular interview at this time of day really does meet, and so I'm happy to talk about what we're going to be covering in the World Affairs Brief tomorrow.
All right, go right ahead.
Well, in this first half of September, Americans are being subjected to the largest propaganda campaign in decades, seeking to make permanent in the American psyche the official version of 9/11. That attack, more infamous than Pearl Harbor, was the work of a lone, and I'm just saying what the official version is, that the attack, more infamous than Pearl Harbor, was the work of a lone cadre of terrorists from the Middle East with virtually no foreknowledge, no direction, no financing, no coordination with dark side elements of the U.S. government. Well, that's the official version. The evidence has been building for years that demonstrates this simply was not true. We are being required to relive over and over again the superficial happenings of that day, and we're being regaled with repetitive human interest stories about heroes and victims and their families and whether or not people, quote, lost faith at ground zero. The media show contains no references to the fact that almost a third of Americans distrust or disbelieve the official version. Well, that is why the massive evidence linking the government foreknowledge and planning to the placement of explosives in the World Trade Center and the massive subsequent cover-up must never be discussed. 9/11 truthers, whether they be architects, engineers, scientists, or pilots, are to be evaded and never allowed to make their case in the mainstream news. Instead, the official version must be drummed into people so that future generations will react with extreme prejudice and disbelief at the mere hint of conspiracy fact or theory. And I think that's where they're heading in all this, Dan.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. But basically, I think an increasing number of people are beginning to suspect that we've been lied to. I think Jesse Ventura has done a great job on that. And simply, you hear these talk show hosts say, "Why are you suggesting that we haven't been told the truth?" And Jesse's remark was, "They lie to us all the time. They lied about Vietnam. They killed 58,000 American boys. Even Robert McNamara has admitted it was all a lie." Well, of course, only 3,000 died on September 11th. That's a pittance compared to the 58,000 they killed because of the lie about the Gulf of Tonkin. I think people are waking up. I really do. We'll be right back with Joel Skousen. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, while I don't have the space time in this interview to go through all of the evidence of government cover-up and involvement in 9/11. The most dramatic evidence comes from the explosive demolition of World Trade Center Building 7. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have produced a couple of videos that will convince almost all but the most hardened skeptics. It's incredible how good these things are. The first is a must-see. The second gives an even wider spectrum of the experts. There's over 1,000 architects and engineers, very credible, all fully credentialed, who just say the National Institute statement that this did not come down by explosives, but was created by furniture fire, of all things, and a portion of the building is just lit.
Joel, go right ahead.
The first video is narrated by Ed Asner. If people will, I have the link in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief. People can get a copy by emailing me at editor@World Affairs Brief. But in the meantime, if they want to go to youtube.com and Google Ed Asner World Trade Center WTC7, the video will come up, and it's just a dramatic presentation of counter-arguments to all the government with just marvelous production skills. The other one is 9/11expertsspeakout.org. This is where you have, and you can click on that by going to Architects for 9/11 Truth, their website. But 9/11 Experts Speak Out is just a litany of one engineer after another talking about how this is impossible, what the government says is happening. Well, the demolition of World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2 hit by airplanes was done by a more sophisticated form of controlled demolition using sequential timers set up by human beings who could observe where the aircraft attacked. You couldn't have done the demolition of World Trade Centers 1 and 2 by the same way that you did Building number 7. Building number 7, they did the standard demolition of cutting all of the 57 columns in the building at one time, and then the building pancakes down on its own footprint. But you can't do that in a big, tall, swaying building like World Trade Center 1 and 2, because if you just cut the bottom columns, the building will most likely, 90% chance, of tilt to one side and actually fall rather than collapse on its own footprint, and the collateral damage would have been much, much greater. So by putting together the scenario of an airplane attacking, which really did happen, I don't believe the laser destruction theories, or there were actually airplanes that did attack the buildings. One of those had a special pod underneath. It was special modification of the airplane, probably filled with fuel.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Professor Joel is simply pointing out that the weakness in the official party line put forward by the people who control our reality is simply that, of course, all the buildings came down because they were hit by planes. But the only trouble is there were 3 buildings that came down and only 2 planes. And so Joel points out that the weakest part of their argument is building number 7. And I will have to admit, it took me 2 years before I could finally convince myself, because I really didn't want to believe that they were that evil, but they were, of course. I should have recognized it, but certainly that they killed all those people. Now, I'm not saying who did it. I do not know what branch of government, but there's obviously a government cover-up. Building 7 was a controlled demolition, as Joel is pointing out. They took Building 7 down in an entirely different way than they took down the other twin towers. The planes hit the buildings, but doesn't because the planes hit the buildings. That doesn't mean for 1 minute that is why the buildings came down. We want to think, well, we saw the planes hit the buildings collapsed, ergo buildings caused the collapse. No, not at all. I mean, there were fires. In fact, the fires weren't even burning very hotly. You can actually see people there suddenly leaning out the windows on these floors where supposedly these terrible fires are raging, and you look inside, and you don't see any fires there. In fact, the firemen have gone up to those floors, announced that the fires were literally out, and yet we want us to believe the fires brought down the building. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, they did this by setting explosives every few floors, triggering sequentially to match the speed of the fall as it was descending. Now, this is not hard to do, just more high-tech. In fact, the height of the Twin Towers, as I said, requires this kind of demolition because you can't just cut all the columns at the bottom. Otherwise, the tower would tilt rather than just collapse on its base. One can even observe the antenna array on the top of the north tower descending slightly before the building itself. Now, this is a sign that the 47 core massive columns in the center had been burned through or compromised with thermite explosives at the base. And that dovetails, of course, with the janitor who claimed that there was a massive explosion in the base and blew out all the windows. By the time the firefighters got into the north tower, the windows were all gone.
In fact, I've talked to William Rodriguez. He told me he'd been repeatedly threatened for telling the truth about what happened that day. Go ahead.
That's correct. Well, the base central columns were too massive for conventional explosives. The collapse of the central core was probably the sign to trigger the rest of the charges in sequential collapse, and that's why a building looks like it, collapsing from the top, descending on the others. But, of course, physics have pointed out in the videos that I mentioned to your listeners that any law of physics would indicate that if the building is collapsing on another tower, you will have resistance. It will push back against it even as it's collapsing below it, and you will fall at much slower than free fall speed. And all of the towers, including World Trade Center 7, are falling for the first, 9 or 10 seconds at free fall speed. Well, with any government cover-up, there's always more evidence that surfaces in later years, just as it did in the Kennedy assassination. The media must then mobilize to explain away or debunk the new evidence that points to government involvement. There's a New York Times story that came out today that contains a lot of disinformation, typical of the mainstream media when they pretend to reveal new light on an old cover-up. Jim Dyers, the author of this New York Times article, he reports that a newly publicized chronicle of the civil and military aviation responses to the hijackers that originally had been prepared by investigators for 9/11 but never completed or released. Threaded into vivid narratives covering each of 4 airliners, the multimedia document contains 114 recordings of air traffic controllers, military aviation officials, airline and fighter pilots, as well as 2 of the hijackers stretching across the 2 hours of September 11th. Well, Stan, this is typical of the propaganda that's being swept out. They are, claiming that they're now revealing 114 recordings that were kept secret from the United States for over 10 years. Well, you have to ask, why is it that they're presenting this now? And you notice that this has been carefully scrutinized. He says, though some of the audio has emerged over the years, mainly through public hearings in a federal criminal trial, the report provides a rare 360-degree view of events that were unfolding at high speed across the Northwest. He writes this like a mystery novel. This week, the complete document with recordings is being published for the first time by Rutgers Law Review, and the selections, if are available, online at NewYorkTimes.com. Well, the U.S. government kept these audio recordings under wrap for so many years because they had to edit out many that gave evidence that the government was stonewalling or intervening to stop the normal scrambling of jet fighters to intercept. You see only hints in what is released. He goes on and says, most of the work of the document, which commission staff members called an audio monograph, was finished in 2004. Here's the excuse coming up. Not in time to go through a long legal review before the commission was shut down in August. Well, how convenient. Oh, it has to go through a long legal review, so we're not going to, reveal any of these things. Well, in fact, they're not revealing all the packets of what was kept from the public. They're only revealing the things that, play into the government's hands. Miles Cara, a retired Army colonel and an investigator for the commission who studied the events of that morning, tracked down the original electronic files earlier this year in the National Archives and finished reviewing and transcribing them with help from law students and John J. Farmer, the dean of Rutgers Law School. Now, that's how it got into the Rutgers Law School Review. Now, the Times is implying here that he did this privately, that he could just walk in to the National Archives to classified material which were held secret and take law students with him and run each through and listen to this and present it. Just didn't happen. This is as bogus as a $3 bill. The main purpose of the government in instigating, and I believe the government is the one who told Miles Cara to go in and do this. This is a complete setup. There's no way anyone, even if they'd been working for the 9/11 Commission, could have got access to these things unless government okayed it. But I think the main purpose of the government doing this was to give the public more history selective as it is, so it reduces the charges that government is holding back information, and which they still are, obviously, and make people less amenable. The government is being more open to these things.
Well, of course, I remember Michael Rupert had written a book, Crossing the Rubicon, which he said, of course, there was a no-fly zone. In other words, no response. Planes are hijacked. They're not to actually scramble the jets. I interviewed a man named Sergeant Leo Chavez, who claimed he was at Comrex, CENTCOM headquarters in Florida that morning. He told me that, of course, there was a no-fly order, no response order. The planes, the fighter planes, were not to try to intercept the plane. Sergeant Leo Chavez disappeared after that. I've tried repeatedly to contact him. Sergeant Leo Chavez, after he was on my program, and you can hear the interview, it's in our 4-tape set on, I said, why did the building come down? Sergeant Leo Chavez just disappeared. It has never, to my knowledge, been heard from since that time. And what did he say? He said there was a no-response order that morning. We always had a response order. It didn't have to go to the vice president or president. Somebody hijacked a plane. Why, you put up fighter planes to see what had happened. But not on the morning of September 11th. I wonder why.
Well, I also have confirmation of this. I got an email on 9/11 from a contact of mine in the military who said his roommate was a tower controller at McGuire Air Force Base and said they got an order from the commanding officers to stand down and not to let any fighters take off.
And ladies and gentlemen, they left those people there to die. They left the almost 3,000 people to die that day, and the murderers are still on the loose. And what they're doing is putting out all sorts of disinformation and misinformation and lies because they control the media. And because they control the media, they largely control what most people think and hear. But fortunately, more and more people, I think, are waking up. And I commend Ed Asner for having the courage to host that, because I will tell you that such strange things have happened to some of the people. I know a number of people who've had their lives threatened, and well, at least one who had died under very mysterious circumstances. But go right ahead. His name incidentally was Jeffrey Berman. You can read about him on the internet. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting, when you do a search on YouTube for Ed Asner and World Trade Center Building 7, you come up with a whole bunch of attacking things on Ed Asner first before you have to scroll down to find the one that you're looking for. In other words, somebody's really putting out a campaign to discredit Ed Asner as being a very prominent actor from the prior era who's going online for this. And it's a very, very credible video. It's one of those keepers that when you run into skeptical people, you can test their honesty by showing them that video. Well, going back to the New York Times disinformation piece, it talks about at hearings in 2003 and 2004, the 9/11 Commission played some of the recordings and said civil and military controllers improvised responses to attacks they had never been trained for. Now, this is the official excuse for the confusion, that nobody was trained. This is just absolutely ludicrous, Dan. There are written procedures for what to do during a hijacking that were in vogue many, many years ago. I mean, this was not the first hijacking that occurred. Remember the wave of hijackings that occurred decades ago? Well, the FAA has procedures. They have intercept procedures. And here they're making it out as if, no one knew what was going on. Here they feature one recording, and this is, selectively, chosen because it appears to confirm this ignorance.
And they always want to come up with this idea, we're just so incompetent, we have no idea what's going on, but we're going to try to do a better job next time. I think they did an excellent job. I think they did exactly what they were supposed to. They wanted those people to die so they could get us into a war with terrorism. And basically, they could justify sending our boys over to, first of all, attack Afghanistan and then to attack Iraq. And it was all planned ahead of time. But, of course, we can't let the American people know, because think of the implications. There is no statute of limitation on murder. And because they keep bringing Dick Cheney forward, he's written a new book, looks like such a nice guy, and of course he has arguments with certain people, Colin Powell, and certainly various George Bush about what's in the book. It's all part of the cover-up, ladies and gentlemen, all part of the cover-up for murder. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, at 9 a.m. on 9/11, a manager, says the New York Times, of air traffic control in New York called Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Herndon, Virginia, trying to find out if the civil aviation officials were working with the military. Here's the quote from the tape. Do you know if anyone down there has any coordination to scramble fighter-type airplanes? The manager asked, continuing, we have several situations going on here. It's escalating big time. We need to get the military involved with us. One plane has already crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Another had been hijacked and was seconds from hitting the second tower, FAA headquarters. Not everyone was up to speed, they say. Why? What's going on? Said the man in Herndon. Just get me someone who has the authority to put military in the air right now, the manager said. So this is the quote that they played. Now, this is a specific example of cherry-picking audio responses, making it appear as if there were no hard and fast response built into the official procedures. There were, and those procedures to launch interceptor aircraft were purposely subverted by late notice or diversions to false targets. The fact that nothing was happening is the real reason why some manager in New York, who obviously was not on the emergency chain of command, starts calling to find out who's in charge, because the emergency chain of command isn't working, and he obviously doesn't know how it works because he's not in the loop. But you see, they're quoting this and not quoting people who are, being subversive about this, which I'm sure they have some of those tapes, because some of those tapes are still being kept secret. Why would they be kept secret? Why not release all the tapes? They go on. In its 2000 report, the Commission praised frontline aviation officials, but it then thoroughly dismantled the accounts of senior government officials, as if the 9/11, report came out and just excoriated senior government officials. This is false. It only pointed out some comedy light errors as if they were errors, not deliberate misdirection, which it really was. Continuing on, who in the weeks after September 11 or for more than a year after assured the public that fighter pilots had been in hot pursuit of the suicidal hijackers. Now, this is true. Military people did cover for the government, claiming that fighter pilots had been in hot pursuit. Well, in truth, a couple were. In fact, they even went into afterburner. But they were only sent after complicit operational commanders knew that it was too late to intercept. In fact, they were sent out over the ocean, not told to turn around until it was too late, even at supersonic speeds. New York Times continues, during these chases, according to accounts from Vice President Dick Cheney, well, that's somebody to quote. This is the guy who was running the operations and telling the Air Force officer not to shoot down any attackers as they were standing in the White House bunker. That's a famous thing related by Leon, not Panetta.
Bonetta.
Bonetta, yes.
Right.
And Mineta was the transportation secretary. He was in the bunker, and he sees this Air Force officer coming into Dick Cheney, and he says that, the airplane's 50, miles out, and then it's 40 miles out. Do the orders still stand? And Cheney says, of course the orders still stand. Now the airplane's 25 miles. Do the orders still stand? He yells back at him, have you heard anything different? Of course the orders still stand. Well, you can tell by the tone of voice, the whole scenario, that the Air Force officer is getting panicky because it's coming close, and some orders are making him panicky. Well, the orders couldn't be, that we're going to interdict it and stop it. The orders have to be to not interdict and stop it. By logic, you have to know that the orders must be, they're never explicitly stated, because he's getting panicky the more closer. In other words,
hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Chris Joel is talking about the stand-down order that morning. Of course, we do know at least some of what happened, because suddenly the Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, was actually, when he testified before the 9/11 Commission, told about that morning. And of course, he was in the bunker down beneath the White House, and there was Dick Cheney, and they were, of course, officer comes in and says, the plane's 50 miles out. And Cheney nods, and then it comes in, the plane's 30 miles out. And then he comes in, the plane is 10 miles out, and the orders still stand. And of course, Dick Cheney whips his neck around. I'm quoting Mineta, whips his neck around and says, of course the orders still stand. And then they asked Mineta, well, what were the orders? And he said, I don't know. Well, obviously the orders were not to try to stop the plane that was coming in into, of course, into Washington, D.C. We know from other sources there was a stand-down order that morning, and Dick Cheney was involved. That's why he's getting this play on his book now. When they brought it out right now, it makes him look like such a nice man. But somebody murdered those almost 3,000 people that morning. But we can't let the American people know why. They might be up in arms about the murderers getting away with it. Just like, of course, they killed 58,000 American boys in Vietnam because they lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But then they lie about everything. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, the New York Times continues, the newly published multimedia documents spell out precisely how the recordings contradicted the accounts of senior officials. You see, the New York Times is making it appear, this is very sophisticated propaganda and disinformation, when it makes it appear as if they're challenging the official view, but in fact they're using straw men, meaning they're using false things that are harmless. They're not really focusing on things which really concentrates on them. Throughout the recordings, they say listeners get a visceral feeling of the desperate scramble for information, as well as the confusion and lack of coordination between civil and military authorities. You see, they're making it out, Stan, as if the only thing wrong was that civil and military authorities are confused, and now they're covering for each other to avoid embarrassment. Not that they're covering because the whole story was a fraud. You see how they use some truth to produce a story that is a cover and it diverts people from the real story, which is one of complicity with the attack. Here's an example of the exchange that indicates confusion. It was just after 9 a.m., 16 minutes after a plane had hit the North Tower, when a radio transmission came from New York Air Traffic Control saying, "Hey, can you look out your window right now?" The caller said, "Yeah," the radar controller said. Can you see a guy about 4,000 feet, about 5 east of the airport now?" "Yeah, I see him." "Do you see the guy looking as he's descending into that building?" "He's descending really quick, too." "Yeah, 4,500 feet right now and closing." "What's the building?" "Oh, what kind of airplane is it?" "I don't know. I'll get a readout in a minute," the manager said. There's no time to read it out. In the background, people can be heard shouting, "Another one just hit the building." Well, so now this is just the kind of drama that the New York Times likes to play upon. But you see, there are other air traffic controllers which they don't give their audio tapes. The one, for example, who claimed, that he actually vectored 2 F-15s to Flight 93 over Pennsylvania. And the plane was shot down, and he heard them report that they'd shot it down. We don't get that tape recording, do we?
Nope, you're talking about, of course, the plane went down and it was Shanksville. That plane crashed into the ground, went nose down, and there was no wreckage. That's the most amazing crash of all time. I've seen the pictures there right after the crash. The plane nose down, goes right into the ground, and absolutely no wreckage there. It's over an 8-mile radius, Obviously, why? Because the motor must have bounced about 2 miles away from there. I mean, basically, ladies and gentlemen, they're lying. If you stop and think of it, but then how could they possibly tell the American people the truth? They might rise up in their righteous indignation and demand, there's no statute of limitation on murder. Any state attorney general who wanted to, any local district attorney, if he had anybody in their area who died that day, could simply bring criminal charges and indict people at the highest levels of our government. I'm pretty sure that man would probably end up very, very dead very soon. They cannot let the American people know the truth. Well, I guess, of course, it's Joel Skousen. We're going to be back here in just a few moments as Joel continues, of course, to elaborate on the background of this massive cover-up. But they're using this, of course, to justify taking away our freedom. I just read an article today how the American people are willing to give up their freedom to be protected from the wicked terrorists. But, ladies and gentlemen, suddenly we've had the shoe bomber, but when they built the bomb, they built it not to explode. We had the underwear bomber, but when they built the bomb, they built it not to explode. They trained this young man over in Pakistan to build a bomb to be set off in Times Square. But it turned out to be a smoke bomb. How could they be so incompetent unintentionally? Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, thanks, Dan. We're talking about the media ploy to use the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 to propagandize the people, to burn into the American psyche that the establishment position or version of events is true, and it is not. And I'm talking about the New York Times article, which is a disinformation piece containing some truth, but always shielding their readers from the real truths they've been on. It continues saying the account published this week is missing two essential pieces that remain restricted or classified, according to Mr. Carr. He was the colonel who was one of the investigators for 9/11 Commission. One is about 30 minutes of the cockpit recording of 9/11 Flight 93, which crashed into the ground after passengers tried to storm the cockpit as hijackers flew across Pennsylvania towards Washington, D.C. Families of some of those on board have objected to the release of that recording, and this is the standard propaganda. I mean, it's incredible. 30 minutes after the supposed, taking over the cockpit, and obviously a lot of stuff went on in there that they don't want anyone to talk about. And I'll tell you what some of those are. Cleveland Center did publish, or not Cleveland Center, but one of the airlines recorded, all the airlines record all the conversations between airline and the various ATC or Air Traffic Control Center that they're flying through. And anytime you're flying through Cleveland Center, for example, there's probably 20 or 30 other aircraft that are flying through at any given time. And there's probably 5 or 10 or 5 aircraft on the same frequency. They divide up the control area into different sectors. And each sector has a different controller, and he's on a separate frequency. So everybody going through the northwest sector heading for Pennsylvania is on the same frequency. So this one airline was listening to air traffic control talk to Flight 93. And he wasn't getting through to him, so he talks to other airplanes. Does anybody else up on this frequency see Flight 93 heading at a certain altitude? And another guy comes up and says, yeah, we see him right down there. And so the reason, and on that frequency, these other aircraft hear when the hijacker accidentally presses the transmit mic rather than the intercom, talking to the passengers and talks about this is a hijacking, we've got a bomb on board, and threatens the people. But he's actually talking to ATC, and ATC tries to come back, and there's this interchange. So all of these 4 or 5 different other airline pilots are hearing this. And only one of them decides to come forth and produce the transcript of what happened. And this is just a gold mine because he says after ATC couldn't any longer talk to Flight 93.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is going to tell us in just a moment some of the real conversations that went on that morning, having to do with Flight 93 that went down in Shanksville. But I was really looking forward to hear what really happened that the government's been trying to cover up. Remember, if you work for the government and you tell the truth, they're going to come after you, and certainly they'll go after your pension, they'll go after your job, they'll go after your family. And, of course, you may end up certainly very dead. And this is, I hate to say this, but this has actually happened. I know of a number of instances where people have tried to get the truth out. They work for government, and they met very, very strange accidents. But be that as it may, Joel, before we get to that aspect of it, describe what really went out over the airwaves that morning from the plane Flight 93. I want you to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, how they can get a free copy of the World Affairs Brief, how they can subscribe to the World Affairs Brief, and tell them about the books that you have, which are among our best sellers, the one on the secure home and certainly the strategic relocation. But go right ahead.
Well, thanks, Dan. The World Affairs Brief is my weekly news analysis service, and it's showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. That's written as always, one word, worldaffairsbrief.com. People can get a free sample issue of the World Affairs Brief by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. This will be a very important one to get a sample issue of because it has these links to these very excellent video presentations. And, it's been my philosophy because of the litany of corruption and cover-up and destructive nature of this particular government that we have, which is not, because President Obama is in there. It's not because of President Bush. It's just a pattern of corrupt leadership that controls every president, both Democratic and Republican, that I believe that even though we alert people and try to fight for our liberty and try to retain and what's good that we've got going on, we still need to prepare for difficult times. It's been my philosophy, and I've stated this for years, that eventually we're headed for a war with Russia and China. I think people need to prepare. The government is certainly not going to prepare, or going to warn us, even though they're preparing for such an attack with deep underground bunkers. And so I've written 3 books that really assist people in doing this in my career as a high-security architect. My main work is called The Secure Home. It's about 700 pages big, and it covers everything from A to Z under high-security construction and remodeling, and as well as self-sufficiency. My bestseller is actually the new 3rd edition of Strategic Relocation. It's an all-new color map edition with a entire new section on foreign international retreating. But I still most highly recommend the rural areas of the West for a retreat, although I do cover, unlike other survival experts, I cover safe places in every state of the Union. And so that book is also available. You can get a description of what's contained in these books at my website, joelskousen.com. But these books are all available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, these are among our most popular books, certainly Secure Home, certainly Strategic Relocation, and Building a Secure Room. But go right ahead, Joel.
Well, thanks, Dan. The ending to this story is that I believe it was the United captain who was on this same frequency and talking to ATC and relaying the messages because ATC, for example, missed the transcription about the threat to the passengers that was accidentally transmitted, and it was relayed by these other captains to ATC. He said, yeah, the guy who said he's got a bomb on board, and so we've got a situation here. And so ATC started to talk to the United captain to relay. Anyway, they couldn't connect anymore to Flight 93, but the United captain finally said, uh-oh, it just exploded. He saw Flight 93 explode in the air. There was a bomb on board, and that's why one of the engines was on. Now, whether or not the entire airplane went down or not, he was too far away, but he did see the explosion. And so clearly the government official version of that is not true, and it may be that whatever small amount of wreckage was there was certainly not enough to be an entire airline. It may have been just a portion of it. But we also know that there was another white airplane, matching description of typical CIA jet, that was shadowing that and flew down around to inspect the wreckage and then flew off. So clearly we're not being told the truth about this.
And if they lie about anything, they lie about everything. And ladies and gentlemen, what do you do with a government official who lies? Well, you promote him, and you give him a very, very fat bonus, and then you give him a great pension. And you go along, you get along, and just and the American people, they figure, are too dumb to understand what's going on. And they just killed another 3,000 Americans, but then they've killed so many others, and then we send our boys off to fight no-win wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and but go right ahead.
Well, it's interesting, the New York Times talks about this still secret recording. You say it's of a high-level conference call that began at 9:28 and grew over the course of the morning to include senior figures like Mr. Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Vice Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff General Richard B. Myers. The recording was turned over to the National Security Council. The 9/11 Commission was not permitted to keep a copy of it or the transcript, Mr. Carr said, and investigators were closely monitored when they listened to it. Mr. Carr said he believed that the only true sensitive material on the recording were small portions that concerned provisions being made to continue government operations if the attacks took some national leadership or facilities. Well, they're lying, of course. It wasn't just about continuity of government. But you see how they, this was obviously very sensitive of Cheney talking to Rumsfeld about what was going on today, and they obviously would have been admitting to such things as, no, we're not going to shoot, we're not going to interdict, this is to be allowed to go forth. And, of course, none of the 9/11 people, they've all been sworn, commission people have been sworn to secrecy that no one can talk about this. But you see, they always give some plausible excuse to divert people away from further investigation. Oh, yeah, well, it's just about continuity. So we can see why government would keep it classified. We don't want our enemies to know what our strategy is for protecting leaders. It's just ludicrous. So this is typical of the type of thing that we're going to keep hearing. Let me cover some other aspects of this.
Well, I think it's vitally important that people understand that basically they are using the tragedy of September 11th to justify imposing dictatorial control over the American people, taking away our freedom to protect us from those wicked terrorists, of course, who've been funded since the very inception of this whole thing by our own government. Certainly, who've been funding Al-Qaeda? Why ISI, Pakistani intelligence? Who funds Pakistani intelligence? Your tax money, the CIA. And you need to understand we've backed the Al-Qaeda since its inception. Certainly you need to get the book, The Devil's Game, available from Radio Liberty. Most of what you will read in the newspaper is carefully filtered, designed to control and alter your reality. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, that needs a perfect lead into where I was going to take us next. What we are witnessing in the world is the near constant utilization of the Hegelian dialectic, which is the theory of forcing change upon an unwilling populace by the systematic creation of crises and the presentation of nice-sounding but evil solutions to the public that they wouldn't otherwise accept, so-called, to save them from the crisis. Well, war is the ultimate motivator of change, as you know, Stan, and terrorism is the ultimate excuse to stay on a war footing forever. And that's what we're seeing here. I believe there were two main purposes for this government-run false flag terror operation. The first was to assist the government's plan in imposing draconian restrictions on travel and movement here and abroad, which they never intend to relinquish. This applies to both physical movement and the transfer of monetary assets. We've learned from the demise of South Africa and other things that they won't allow people to take their money outside the country. That's why there's a lot of interest in the international retreat section of strategic relocation. A lot of people are looking to establish assets overseas to get them out of the way of the government if they ever should decide to flee. But the attack also begins the destruction of a host of constitutional legal guarantees such as habeas corpus, right to a speedy trial, freedom from warrantless searches and indefinite detention. Your listeners may not think that any of those legal losses apply to them, only foreign terrorists, but that isn't true. Each and every one of the above-mentioned violations has been imposed upon U.S. citizens and have been upheld by higher courts without much fanfare. Just because they haven't applied them to us doesn't mean they don't intend to in the future. They certainly have set the legal precedent of knocking down those restrictions if you are accused of being terrorism, and they don't even have to prove that. Of course, constant electronic surveillance of all communications is now being practiced by various agencies of government. The NSA has been illegally recording telephone and radio transmissions since World War II, but 9/11 gave them the excuse to expand that, still mostly secret, to all domestic internet and cell phone conversations. Well, the attack on 9/11 has also been used to justify unlimited intervention around the world, a permanent fixture in American foreign policy. U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker to Afghanistan, he's an old political hack who directed the State Department betrayals of pro-U.S. allies all over Central America and Africa, said this week the United States, get this, will continue to have to occupy Afghanistan for the foreseeable future because of 9/11. You see how they use this excuse, just as you were saying, Dr. Stan. And because if the occupation ended, 9/11 might happen again. That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm sure Crocker knows all too well that the U.S. does and will continue to use terror as a weapon.
And, of course, the interesting thing about that is that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. If we're worried about the hijackers and the cause of the hijacking, maybe we ought to attack Saudi Arabia and occupy Saudi Arabia. After all, 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. Why didn't we attack Saudi Arabia? Go right ahead.
Well, the reason is, of course, that the U.S. was controlling the terror network through Saudi Arabia, and that's where they were recruited. And, you know, there's a whole litany of evidence that shows how the CIA had worked with them. Some of them had been trained at U.S. air bases. They'd all been in the United States previously. The U.S. had large files on these people. These were controlled terrorists. And they were recruited, I believe, most of them, in Saudi Arabia through Saudi Arabia intelligence operations. Well, I'm sure that, as I say, Crocker knows all about, he's a globalist, he knows about this agenda. Threats like this are easy to turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. When Americans get fed up with airline searches, they just produce another mind-controlled shoe or crotch bomber who doesn't have sufficient training to know that you can't set off plastic explosives with a match. But they don't intend to bring down the plane. They just intend to have a terrorist incident of which they can justify continually goading Americans into accepting these indecencies and delays and harassment by the TSA. It's the same thing in Europe. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl once told a fractious EU conference considering monetary union or objecting to monetary union that, quote, the only alternative to monetary union is a war. And everyone was shocked. There's no danger of war in Europe, they said. No such sentiment at all. What they didn't realize is that Kohl was a globalist and knew that should the European Union or European countries fail to agree to a monetary union, the powers that be would give them a war to force it upon them, and other measures, of course, driving them together. That's what terrorism is all about, driving people toward government salvation. But that salvation comes at the price of liberty, where dissenters are rounded up and put in concentration camps for the, quote, good of the nation.
And the average American, so many of them do accept what the government says. After all, my government wouldn't lie. It's not our government that's lying. There is an invisible government that sees control of our government and makes mockery of, course, the concept of democracy. Basically, we don't have representative government. We have the same people controlling both political parties. Isn't it interesting that certainly Governor Perry has been to the Bildergerg meetings?
Twice.
Twice, right. Here's an impartial man. How could he? It was only a little less than 2 weeks ago when he declared his political candidacy for the Republican nomination for presidency, and already he is the #1 contender. In fact, he was the #1 contender within 5 days of his declaring it. Why? Who wanted Governor Perry? Why, the same establishment that created this war. Go right ahead.
Well, speaking of Governor Perry, the Republican debates at the Reagan Library were interesting for a couple of reasons. It's very, very obvious that the media, you know, is promoting the candidacy of Rick Perry. This guy is really, I think, a true wolf in sheep's clothing. You know, this is not a dupe. This is the person who's met with Bilderberg twice. They don't meet with people unless they're certified to not give away their secrets. That doesn't mean they're a all-knowing conspirator because they go to Bilderberg, because it's kind of a leadership training mission for things. But clearly, Perry exhibits some of the aggressive alpha male characteristics that you would expect from a globalist who pretends to be a Christian, who held this great rally in Houston, but I think is frankly lying. Just like Newt Gingrich is a lying Christian, Bill Clinton was a lying Christian, and George Bush was a lying Christian. But this is very effective, and they play it with George Bush, and I think they're going to play it again. But Alex Jones had a very interesting commentary on a couple of pictures as during the break there in the debate where Rick Perry got in Ron Paul's face. I don't know if you've seen those pictures.
No, I haven't. What happened?
He walked up, across to the podium, rapidly grabbed him by the wrist, and then shook his finger right in his face about 2 inches from his nose. You know, he's got a very menacing, you know, look on his face. And then he backs Ron Paul up, and Ron Paul has to back away from the podium, and he's just gesticulating with his arms, and you know, really in his face, it just shows this is an aggressive personality. Very disturbing, but it's no surprise to us who believe that he can't stand the light of day, and Ron Paul really took him to task. It was very clear in the debate, Stan, if you saw any of those, that they had prepared the questions, they prepared the thing to showcase Perry, especially in the beginning. They put Perry against Romney, and Romney, frankly, defended himself very, very well. Perry didn't come off very well. Romney's real chink in his army, of course, is having stupidly defended the mandate in the Massachusetts system, and so he's having to bend over backward to say the first thing he would do would we have an executive order that allows states to opt out of the mandate. Well, that's an easy fudging thing. You know, he has the power to probably stop its implementation in other ways. But, you know, too many states will not allow people to opt out. But Perry, of course, you know, has gone after Social Security, and that's probably the chink in the armor. It was made an issue there, and nobody probably can survive specifically in this election or any election by attacking Social Security.
And yet, of course, Social Security is going to be destroyed. There's just no way. Possibly it's going to be able to survive financially, but I'm sure nobody's going to want to say that. But all you need to know is we've got 56 people retired, 56 million people retired, and another 75 to 79 million retiring in the next 20 years. Where's the money coming from? For Social Security. It's a Ponzi scheme, ladies and gentlemen, and they put Bernie Madoff in prison. Why don't we put some of our elected representatives in prison? Go right ahead there.
Let me switch topics and talk a little bit about Cheney's self-serving view of the world. Dick Cheney's personal and political memoir, My Time, is about as self-serving as work as I have ever reviewed. Not only a personal justification of war, torture, and executive arrogance for the promotion of the entire globalist agenda which he serves. Cheney continues to play the role of the reluctant warrior whose mission was thrust upon him by circumstances he never sought, an outright lie for someone who was high up enough in the globalist hierarchy to serve as the president's handler during the entire Bush administration. No other vice president before or since has wielded the kind of power Cheney had, who kept 800 connected staff and spies throughout every hall of government, through which the vice president kept tabs on and directed the affairs of government. And so there's a little bit of disinformation. Also, if anybody's looking, of course, for any admissions that Bush lied about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you won't find that. As one man said, no one would expect Dick Cheney's memoir to have anything but frank, commentary commensurate with Cheney's utter lack of humility. Brutally frank, but he's the ultimate warmonger. What's happening in this book, of course, is that he places several pieces of disinformation about talking about having run into a conflict with complaining about a leak that went forward about the government's position on Iraq and the weakness of their strategy in Iraq. And supposedly, Michael Hayden of the NSA comes into Cheney after he was complaining about this and said, hey, you better shut up about complaining because the source of that leak was actually George Bush. He authorized this. Well, it actually was all a lie. In fact, Cheney's the one who authorized the leak. He turned the tables and made it appear as if Bush was to promote the propaganda that Bush was in charge as president. I mean, there's all kinds of little lies like this that went on in the book. His story about Secretary of State Colin Powell and objecting to what he had to present at the UN about weapons of mass destruction, and said that they brought in George Tenet to tell him about this agent that they had who had confessed that there was a relationship with the Al-Qaeda. And then after he got him to give the speech, of course, Cheney didn't say in the book that the guy recanted and said that he confessed only under torture. So these are the kinds of half-truths that Cheney's been putting out in this book. And I'm sure it's going to be a bestseller, but this is a massive piece of propaganda.
Well, I think most of the things that we read today, the things we read in the newspapers, the things we read in the news magazines, the things we hear on television, and certainly most of what we hear on the radio is propaganda. Thank goodness for the Internet and for alternative radio. God bless you, Joe. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you, Stan.
Bye-bye. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course, I hope you enjoyed the conversations with Joel. But this is absolutely true. The media in America is controlled by 6 major corporations. AOL, Time Warner has a massive media empire. Bertelsmann has a massive media empire. Viacom, a massive media empire. Disney, a massive media empire. GE, Comcast, massive media empires, and Rupert Murdoch and Fox, massive media empire. They control 90 to 95% of the media outlets in America, and they largely control what the American people think. The New York Times is part and parcel of this, as is the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Time Magazine, and Newsweek Magazine, and you can't believe any of them. That's why you need to get onto the Internet. You need to know who you can trust. And certainly we'll try to get these people on a regular basis, or if you have any questions, you can always call us. Our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. Certainly you want to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. And certainly you'll want to get the new talk we're going to be giving on the 17th. And we'll go into a lot of the things we've just covered. It's going to be called The Covert Agenda. We'll have that available on a DVD along with an excellent syllabus here in the very near future. But basically, people have to understand that we're being manipulated into a financial catastrophe intentionally, because they're going to destroy our economy, they're going to destroy the value of our currency, they're going to impoverish the American people, they're going to expand the police state. They know exactly what they're doing, but they don't want the American people to know what they're doing. There is an invisible government, and that's why my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, is so important. Why my talks on the forbidden secret and the dark secret are important, and you need to get the syllabus to go with that. If you want to understand what's really going on and how things really work behind the scenes, you need to get my talk on Iraq, the untold story, and the syllabus that goes with that, because there's all sorts of documents there. All of the wars have been contrived, including World War II. If you don't realize, of course, that it was American corporations, GE, General Motors, Ford, IT&T, IBM, that were building the weapons that were being used to kill the American servicemen during the Second World War. Why did the books cover that? Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, America's Nazi Secret, and Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam. That's Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, America's Nazi Secret, and Trading with the Enemy. The trilogy, they're all available from Radio Liberty. And if you want the letter that I found from Ambassador Dodd, the American ambassador to Germany in 1936, writing to Colonel House saying, why are 100 American corporations over here building the weapons for the German military? Nobody wants a war. There's no profit to be made. And poor old Ambassador Dodd didn't understand. It wasn't about profit. They wanted the war so that they could bring in the United Nations and a world government. That's the ultimate goal. If you don't believe there's a conspiracy, of course, you need to get Professor Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, and his other book, The Anglo-American Establishment. You need to get the book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. They've done everything they could to suppress that book. We've kept it in print for the last, almost 20 years. Foundations, Their Power and Influence, a vitally important book. How the great tax exempt foundations financed, of course, the communism. We had to have an enemy, and financed socialism, and certainly able to take over our political process and push the United Nations, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation. Why would Henry Ford do that? Because he was deeply involved in the occultism with the Rockefeller family and people within the Rothschild family and people within the Mellon family and the Whitney family. You need to get the facts. You need, of course, to join together with Radio Liberty as we try to get the information out. If you're in a position to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters, our number 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Go to our webpage. You can listen to our programs there on the Internet 24 hours a day. And please pray for Radio Liberty, our provision and protection.